Years ago, there was a pretty remarkable scandal in our little Baptist corner of the religious world. A pastor was being charged with some serious allegations, and all signs seemed to point to pretty much a public firing from the church. I was in seminary at the time, and of course, we were all talking about it. I asked a professor what made such a prominent pastor make such foolish decisions. The answer my professor gave me, I've never forgotten. He has no moral center, no compass, no guiding light, no center in which life springs forth or out of or into. There was no core that rooted this pastor in morality or even Christian character. Without that core anchor, this person was willing and free to break whatever rules needed to feel powerful or to be successful or to feel lifted up. He had no moral center. What Jesus says to the Pharisees here in Matthew 22, I can't help but see in this way. We are hearing Jesus' core, his motivating center, the anchor and guiding light that drives who he is as a person. At the center of who Jesus is love, the love of God, others, and self. Now we know this as the greatest commandments, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as you love yourself. It's the core, the anchor of who Jesus is, and it should be for us too. We love God and love others as we love ourselves. There's so much packed into just these few verses, and as a number of ways you can take it and interpret it. And I want to break these down together, but first, let's keep in mind the framework that we're working on in this sermon series. Jesus is in Jerusalem, the last week of his life. He has had two very aggressive showdowns in the temple already with the chief priest and the Sadducees. Terse language and parables have been shared. Now he's confronted by the Pharisees. And you may be wondering, what's the difference between Pharisees and Sadducees? So real quick, here's how I would explain it. The Sadducees are the temple priests. When you go into the temple, there are people working there, performing rituals and customs and keeping order of the temple. They run the temple. They're the aristocrats. They even help shape the laws that exist in the city. They work well with the Pharisees, but the Pharisees are different. They're out in the city, not in the temple. They're the scholars, the theologians, boots on the ground, keeping order out there. And these two groups have slightly different opinions about things. For instance, we know that the Sadducees, they don't talk much about the afterlife, and they don't really adhere to doctrines like the resurrection of the dead. But we know the Pharisees do. So there are some differences. Now, how these sects came to pass are kind of beyond us. The Sadducees are definitely a remnant of ancient Israel temple practices, and the Pharisees are a younger sect that emerged, what we believe, during the intertestamental period between Old and New Testaments, perhaps when the temple was destroyed and no one was going there to keep their religious order. Regardless, both have their little corners of the world that they manage. The Sadducees want Jesus arrested, if not dead. Jesus has insulted them to their face and desecrated their temple. And so now the Pharisees want to see what's going on. Verse 34. When the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. One of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest? Now, it's not hard to see that this meeting is an attempt to trap and even corner Jesus on behalf of their relationship with the Sadducees. This is not a good meeting. It is tense. And in the midst of it, Jesus gives one of the most repeatable answers in all of Scripture. Verse 37. He said to him, to the lawyer, who would have been quite accustomed to the laws of Moses and would not ever really need an answer to this question, but regardless, here's what Jesus says. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang the law and the prophets. So yeah, the context of this moment is tense. But what bubbles up from Jesus is his core operating principles. You shall love the Lord your God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength. This is the greatest and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang the law and the prophets. I mean, what we're seeing is Jesus' moral center through and through. It is built on and around love. The love of God, the love of others, the love of self. The love of God, the love of others, the love of self. And these are not sectarian ideas. They're Trinitarian, so to speak. They go together. You don't love God separately from others or self. You love God and others and self. You have the greatest commandment, which is followed by another that is like it. They are two in the same and contain three parts: God, others, and self. The core of the Christian life, the core of who we are. Our guiding light must be a spring of love for God, others, and self. I can't say it enough. God, others, and self. This is what anchors us to the deepest, most spiritual realities of the world. And like Jesus, it's what should bubble out of us when people push our buttons or seek to humiliate, even entrap us or attack us or hurt us or overlook us. The anchor of our lives must be love. So I think this moment really tells us something amazing about Jesus. He builds his life on the law of love. And Jesus also shows us something amazing about God. You know, we associate love with Jesus, and I think that's easy. He's a nice guy. He heals people. He loves people. It's very obvious. But we don't often associate love with God. For most people, God is a God of justice and righteousness. That's why God gave us the laws and the 10 commandments. God is like a judge waiting to count our misdeeds, as if God is passionless and just wants order and right behavior. Many of us have learned that this is more of who God is. But I think what we're seeing from Jesus is that's wrong. Jesus is pointing to the Pharisees to a truer nature of who God and the law is. Look at verse 40. On these two commandments hang all the laws and the prophets. On these two commandments about love hang the core attributes of God. It's God's guiding light, which means God's laws are meant to point us finally and forever to the greatest law, the core law, which is love. It's that simple and that difficult, because this means we're going to have to put at our core the love of God, others, and self. If we're not, we're getting it wrong. Anything less than love is not strong enough to anchor us to be Christians or to act Christianly in the world. And we must love God, others, and ourselves, or we're getting it wrong. Now, I could talk about each of these for hours, and there's so much more that needs to be said, but that's perhaps another sermon for another day. I'll just end with this. Our core operating principle matters. Jesus is challenging the Pharisees on what theirs is. It can't just be law and order. It must be deeper. It must be love. And that love must be anchored deep within, so our emotions and decisions and character and morals and lives spring out of it. Our life's foundation must be love. The Pharisees clearly needed to be reminded of this. And we Christians, we do too.